All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping right into a really potent analysis of Bolivia's economic crisis. It comes from economist Carlos Ibáñez Meyer. And look, he's proposing a path forward that's, well, it's pretty controversial. In fact, in his view, it's the only path. So let's break down what he's arguing.
And he starts off with a pretty blunt assessment, right? He doesn't pull any punches. This quote right here really sets an urgent tone for everything that follows. He's basically saying, hey, this isn't some theoretical problem down the road. No, it's happening now, and it's getting worse every single week.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we're going to look at what the crisis actually feels like on the ground for people. Then, we'll get into the anatomy of the problem, what's really causing it. After that, we'll tackle the big, controversial idea, the IMF as the key. We'll talk about the money, a lot of money, and then address the big counter-argument. Is the IMF different now? And finally, we'll land on the stark choice that the author lays out for Bolivia.
All right, let's get into it. First things first, what does this crisis actually look like? How does it show up in daily life for people in Bolivia, according to this analysis?
So the author points to these 5 things as the tangible symptoms. You've got a scarcity of dollars, which is a huge deal. You've got fuel shortages. The country's international reserves are plummeting. And behind all of that, a government that's been spending more than it takes in for years, that's the chronic fiscal deficit, and an economic model that, in the author's words, is just exhausted.
So how did all these problems get so bad? Well, the analysis describes this really dangerous feedback loop. It's almost like a vicious cycle, trapping the economy.
And at the heart of it all is what the author calls a spiral of imbalances. You can think of it as a crisis of confidence, right? People start to lose faith in the local currency, the Boliviano. So what do? They rush to buy a currency they do trust, US dollars. But that rush drains the central bank's dollar reserves. And when those reserves get low, it gets harder and harder to import essentials, like fuel. Then you have fuel shortages, which makes people panic even more, and the whole cycle just gets worse and worse, leaving the central bank with pretty much no good options.
So, with the country stuck in this spiral, the author argues that, quick fixes and populist promises just aren't going to cut it. He says those are dead ends. Instead, he proposes what he calls the only realistic path out of this mess.
And here it is. This is the central argument. The only way, in his view, to avoid a total collapse is a structured program that is backed by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. But here's the thing. It's not just about getting a loan from them. No, it's about getting something that he sees as much, much more important.
This is where it gets really interesting. The author's view of the IMF's role isn't just as a lender, it's as an institutional guarantee. It's a signal of credibility. He's arguing that the IMF holds the key. Without their stamp of approval, nobody else, not the World Bank, not other development banks, not private bond markets, is going to lend Bolivia a dime. The IMF is the gatekeeper. And this really illustrates the chain of events he's laying out. An IMF deal is step 1. It's the non-negotiable first domino to fall. Signing that agreement provides that institutional guarantee we just talked about. That's what unlocks the door to get big loans from the World Bank and other development funds. And once that happens, Bolivia can go back to the international bond markets to raise even more money. The final step, the country's whole risk profile improves. It's all a sequence.
Okay, let's move on to the money. What does this rescue package look like in terms of cold, hard cash? What's the price tag on this whole plan?
The number he puts out there is pretty huge. We're talking about $7 to $10 billion. The thinking is that you need that kind of massive cash injection over the next 3 years to really stabilize the entire economy. So where does all that money come from? Well, this is what's so interesting. If you look at the breakdown, the IMF's actual loan is a pretty small piece of the pie, only about 16%. Its main job here isn't to be the biggest lender, but to be the catalyst. It's the key that unlocks all the much larger chunks from the World Bank, sovereign bonds, and other creditors. And there's a very clear plan for how to use this money. It's not just a blank check. The biggest chunk, $3 to $4 billion, goes straight to rebuilding the central bank's dollar reserves. The goal there? Guarantee currency access and stop the panic. Then you have funds to stabilize the exchange rate and, crucially, to finance the government's deficit so it can keep paying things like salaries and pensions. And finally, there's about $1 billion set aside for strategic public investments to try and reactivate the economy for the long haul.
Now, the author knows that for a lot of people, especially in Latin America, the letters IMF bring up some pretty bad memories. There's a lot of historical baggage there. So he makes a point to address this fear directly.
And he's very direct about it. He says, look, the fear of IMF programs is understandable. He gets it. People remember the draconian adjustments from past decades, these really harsh, painful austerity policies that were forced on countries and created a lot of social suffering.
However, and this is a huge however in his argument, the claim is that the IMF is different now. The old programs were seen as rigid, draconian, and just imposed from Washington. The argument today is that the new approach is way more flexible, it's gradual, and, this is the most important part, it allows countries to design their own recovery programs instead of just having one forced upon them. So, after all this analysis, after all the numbers and the arguments, the author boils this whole complex situation down to a single, really stark choice. Two futures for Bolivia. And this is the choice he presents. It's not about a tough plan versus just keeping things the same. No, he says the status quo is gone. The real choice is between path 1, an orderly recovery, which is a structured, internationally backed plan to stabilize and rebuild. It'll be hard, but it's a plan. Or path 2, a disorderly collapse. That means more improvisation, deeper and deeper shortages, and just letting that spiral of imbalances spin completely out of control. And in the end, his conclusion is absolutely unequivocal. To him, trying to follow any other path, trying to find some other magical solution, is simply fiction. He's basically saying it's denying reality.
And that leaves us right back here, with the central question at the heart of this entire analysis. Is an IMF-backed program really the only realistic path forward for Bolivia? Is it, as the author argues, a case of bitter but necessary medicine? Or is there another way out of this crisis? That's the huge question now facing the country.